For decades, I held firm to the belief that the house where you nurture your children transforms into hallowed ground, a sanctuary where love reverberates through each room, passed down through generations. But on that ordinary Tuesday morning, my son's words demolished 4 decades of cherished memories, as if they were fragile glass meeting hard pavement. The coffee was still brewing when I heard their voices through the thin walls of what used to be my bedroom. Michael and Rebecca were discussing my future like I was a piece of furniture. My fingers traced the familiar groove in the kitchen counter where I'd chopped vegetables for countless family dinners. Everything looked exactly the same as yesterday, yet somehow the entire world had shifted overnight. Michael appeared in the doorway with that expression he'd perfected over the past 2 years, a mixture of forced patience and barely concealed irritation. Rebecca followed close behind, her designer clothing and perfect makeup creating an invisible barrier between us that no amount of politeness could bridge. The conversation that followed felt like drowning in slow motion. Their words washed over me in waves of reasonable explanations and practical concerns, each sentence pulling me further from the surface of my own life. They'd even brought glossy brochures filled with photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in crafts and gentle exercise programs. The pictures showed a sanitized version of aging, where everyone looked content and properly supervised. The financial arrangements had already been made, they explained with the satisfaction of people who'd solved a complex puzzle. My pension would cover most of the costs, and they'd generously agreed to supplement the difference. When I tried to voice my concerns about leaving the only home I'd known for decades, Michael's patience finally cracked like ice under pressure. His voice rose to fill the kitchen with an authority that left no room for negotiation. The words that had been building behind his controlled facade finally erupted with volcanic force. "You don't live here anymore." The silence that followed his outburst stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged with apologies or explanations. But instead of crumbling under the weight of their rejection, something unexpected happened. A calm certainty settled over me like a warm blanket on a cold morning. I looked at my son, this stranger wearing my child's face, and felt the last threads of obligation finally snap. Setting my untouched coffee on the counter with steady hands, I met their shocked stares with the composure of someone who'd finally found solid ground beneath her feet. The response that rose from somewhere deep inside my chest surprised even me with its quiet strength and absolute certainty. "I know that." Michael's face had shifted from anger to something resembling panic, while Rebecca gripped the back of a chair as if the kitchen floor might open beneath her feet. They'd expected tears, pleading, perhaps the kind of dramatic breakdown that would justify their careful plans for my future. Instead, I found myself remembering the day we'd moved into this house 43 years ago, standing in the kitchen where so many family decisions had been made over the years. I finally understood that this moment had been inevitable from the day David died. The irony wasn't lost on me that the child I'd raised to be strong and independent had decided that strength and independence were luxuries his aging mother couldn't afford. Rebecca's fingers drummed nervously against the chair back as she watched me process their ultimatum. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite conceal the strain around her eyes. Michael shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, perhaps recognizing something unfamiliar in my expression. The mother he'd grown accustomed to managing with efficient authority had been replaced by someone he didn't quite recognize. The power dynamic that had governed our interactions for the past 2 years crumbled in an instant. They'd expected the familiar dance of protest, followed by reluctant compliance. Rebecca found her voice first, though it came out higher and thinner than her usual controlled tone. Her words tumbled over each other in a rush to regain control of a conversation that had veered wildly off their prepared script. But her explanations fell flat against the wall of calm certainty that had settled around me. Each reasonable argument she offered only highlighted the distance between what they called love and what I had finally recognized as systematic dismantling of my autonomy. Michael attempted a different approach, his voice carrying the patronizing tone I'd grown to recognize as his default setting when discussing my future. The breakfast nook where we'd solved homework problems and planned family vacations now felt like a courtroom where my competency was being evaluated by judges who'd already reached their verdict. Rebecca produced folders of paperwork from her oversized purse, spreading documents across the table with the efficiency of a real estate agent closing a particularly challenging sale. But numbers on paper couldn't capture the value of morning coffee in a kitchen where every surface held memories, or the satisfaction of tending a garden that had grown more beautiful with each passing season. Michael's tone grew more insistent as he sensed his careful arguments failing to produce the desired result. He spoke about his responsibilities as my son, about the burden of worry he carried when I lived alone. The irony of the situation struck me with sudden force. The child I'd raised to question authority and think independently was now demanding that I surrender both qualities in the name of his peace of mind. Rebecca's approach shifted to what I recognized as emotional manipulation, her voice taking on the saccharine sweetness she used when trying to coax cooperation from reluctant clients in her real estate business. Her description of my future sounded like a resort vacation, designed specifically for people who'd forgotten how to make their own decisions. Standing in the kitchen, where I'd comforted them through childhood nightmares and adolescent heartbreaks, I felt the last emotional bonds that had kept me tethered to their vision of my future finally snap. The woman who had spent 2 years allowing herself to be gradually diminished was gone, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to trust her own judgment. Michael's face had gone pale as he began to realize that their carefully constructed plan was encountering unexpected resistance. Rebecca's professional composure cracked slightly around the edges. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the passage of time in a morning that had already lasted longer than some entire chapters of my life. The kitchen felt different now, as if the very air had changed composition. Where minutes before I'd been drowning in their reasonable explanations, I now found myself breathing easily. My mind began working with a precision I hadn't experienced in months. The fog of guilt and uncertainty that had clouded my thinking lifted like morning mist. The financial documents scattered across my kitchen table suddenly looked less like inevitable conclusions and more like opening moves in a negotiation where I'd simply forgotten I had the right to participate as an equal partner. Rebecca's folder of assisted living brochures lay open between us, displaying photographs of elderly people engaged in supervised activities under fluorescent lighting. The images that had seemed welcoming now struck me as subtly disturbing in their uniformity. Standing in the kitchen where I'd managed household budgets for 4 decades, I found myself remembering skills I'd thought were no longer relevant. My Social Security and pension would cover basic living expenses in this house I owned outright. The financial emergency that Michael and Rebecca had presented as inevitable began to look more like an assumption they'd made rather than a conclusion they'd proven. Rebecca's voice broke the silence with a question that revealed more about her priorities than she'd probably intended. She wanted to know what I planned to do about maintenance issues that would inevitably arise. But I had been solving problems for 75 years, often with limited resources and no instruction manual. The woman who'd raised 2 children, largely on her own, while working part-time, hadn't suddenly lost her capacity for creative problem-solving. Michael's frustration was becoming increasingly visible as he realized that his carefully prepared arguments were being systematically dismantled by someone he'd underestimated. The word burden hung in the air between us, like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering unnoticed for years. In that single syllable, I heard the truth about how my presence in their lives had been reframed. The realization struck me that their urgent need to place me in supervised care had less to do with my safety and well-being than with their desire to limit their liability for my choices. The kitchen window above the sink framed my garden, where spring flowers were beginning to emerge from soil I'd tended for decades. The daffodils didn't care that I was 75 years old. That image of persistent growth, despite external challenges, seemed to capture something essential about the choice I was facing. I could allow myself to be transplanted to institutional soil, where my needs would be efficiently met, but my roots would never have the chance to deepen. Rebecca was shuffling through her papers now, searching for additional arguments, or perhaps simply buying time, while she tried to process the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. The morning sun had climbed higher while we'd been talking, filling the kitchen with the kind of warm light that made everything appear exactly as it was, rather than as others wished it to be. The woman who had agreed to bank statements being redirected, to doctor's appointments being rescheduled, to social activities being curtailed for my own good, was finally ready to reclaim the authority she'd never actually surrendered. The afternoon had arrived while we stood in the kitchen, suspended in a conversation that had veered so far from their planned script that neither Michael nor Rebecca seemed certain how to proceed. Rebecca's attempts to regain control of the narrative had grown increasingly desperate, cycling through various emotional appeals with the systematic approach of someone working down a checklist of persuasion techniques. But her arguments felt hollow now, echoing in the space between what she claimed to want for me and what she clearly wanted for herself. Michael had moved to stand beside her, presenting a united front that might have been intimidating if I hadn't spent decades observing the dynamics of their relationship. The conversation had revealed the careful planning that had preceded this morning's confrontation. References to appointments they'd made, deposits they'd placed, arrangements they'd confirmed, painted a picture of decisions made without my input. The efficiency of their preparations was almost admirable in its thoroughness. They'd researched facilities, compared costs, evaluated options, and selected what they determined was the best available solution for managing their aging mother problem. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of their good intentions and careful planning, I felt something shift in my understanding of family loyalty and filial responsibility. The love I'd interpreted as protection revealed itself as control, disguised in reasonable concerns and practical necessities. My response surprised even me with its quiet firmness. The words emerged from a place of absolute certainty, carrying none of the hesitation or apology that had characterized my communications with them over the past 2 years. Michael's face registered something that might have been respect mixed with alarm, perhaps recognizing for the first time the woman who'd raised him with enough backbone to stand up to anyone who tried to diminish his worth. Rebecca's professional composure cracked entirely, revealing the frustration of someone accustomed to closing deals, who suddenly found herself facing a client who refused to be managed, manipulated, or convinced to act against her own interests. But her anger only reinforced my growing understanding that their concern had always been more about their comfort than my welfare. The peace of mind they sought required my compliance with arrangements that would fundamentally alter my quality of life, while leaving theirs essentially unchanged, except for the relief of knowing I was someone else's responsibility. The financial documents spread across my table began to look less like inevitable conclusions and more like one possible scenario among many. Home maintenance contracts could address their concerns about my ability to handle repairs and upkeep. Medical alert systems could provide emergency response capabilities. Meal delivery services could ensure proper nutrition without requiring institutional dining. Each solution I outlined carried costs, but none approached the financial devastation their plan would inflict on my savings, and none required the complete surrender of autonomy they'd presented as the only viable option. Michael's attempts to interrupt my planning, with objections about my capacity to manage such arrangements, only highlighted his fundamental misunderstanding of my capabilities. The woman who'd organized countless school events, managed complex household budgets, and navigated bureaucratic systems to secure services for her family, hadn't suddenly lost her ability to research options and make informed decisions. Rebecca's final argument revealed the true source of their urgency. Her pregnancy timeline required resolution of the grandmother problem before the baby arrived, creating a deadline that had nothing to do with my actual needs. The child they'd mentioned as motivation for ensuring my proper care was actually the reason they needed me relocated before I could become an inconvenient complication in their new family structure. The morning that had begun with coffee and casual conversation had transformed into something that felt like a declaration of independence. Michael's voice carried a new note when he pointed out that they'd already made commitments, placed deposits, and created expectations that would be difficult to reverse. But their embarrassment wasn't my responsibility, just as their peace of mind wasn't worth the price they were asking me to pay for it. The afternoon light slanting through my kitchen windows illuminated the scene with the kind of clarity that makes everything appear exactly as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. The family I'd thought I was protecting by cooperating with their gradual assumption of control over my life had revealed itself as something quite different from what I'd believed it to be. The silence that followed my declaration stretched through the kitchen like a held breath. Rebecca's folder of carefully organized documents lay forgotten on the table, their neat columns of figures suddenly irrelevant. Michael broke first, his voice carrying a tremor I hadn't heard since he was a small boy, facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. He spoke about responsibilities and obligations, about the weight of worry he carried, and the sleepless nights spent imagining disasters that could befall me in this house they now viewed as a collection of hazards. But his words revealed more about his own anxiety than any actual assessment of my situation. The fears he described sounded like projections of his own mortality concerns. Rebecca's response carried the sharp edge of someone whose carefully laid plans had encountered unexpected resistance. She spoke about ingratitude and selfishness, about the burden of constant worry. Her accusations struck me as particularly revealing because they assumed that my primary obligation was to minimize their discomfort rather than maximize my own well-being. The kitchen, where we'd shared countless meals and conversations, had become a courtroom where my competency was being challenged by people whose authority I'd never actually granted them. Standing among the familiar surfaces and objects that had anchored my daily routines for decades, I felt a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. Michael's tone shifted toward something that sounded like pleading, mixed with frustration. He painted a picture of himself as a dutiful son trapped between conflicting obligations, but his description of filial duty felt hollow when measured against his actual behavior over the past 2 years. The son who claimed to worry about my welfare had systematically isolated me from support networks. Rebecca's folder contained photographs of the assisted living facility they'd selected, glossy images of smiling elderly residents engaged in supervised activities and comfortable common areas. The people in those photographs looked pleasant and well cared for, but none of them looked like they were living their own lives rather than having life done to them by well-meaning professionals. My own daily routines might have seemed unremarkable to outside observers, but they belonged to me in a way that no amount of professional care could replicate. Michael's voice grew more insistent as he realized that logical arguments and emotional appeals were failing to produce the compliance he'd expected. He spoke about legal obligations and family responsibilities, about the guilt he would carry if my stubborn independence resulted in accident or injury that proper supervision could have prevented. But his concern about potential guilt seemed to matter more to him than my actual safety or happiness. Rebecca's approach had shifted toward what I recognized as emotional manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for causing them distress. She spoke about the stress my resistance was placing on their marriage, about the sleepless nights and constant worry, about the way my stubbornness was affecting their ability to enjoy their pregnancy. Her words painted me as the villain in a story where their happiness depended on my cooperation with arrangements I found unacceptable. The realization struck me that they'd never actually asked what I wanted or how I envisioned my remaining years. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life fully lived and still unfolding, I felt the last traces of guilt and obligation finally release their hold on my decision-making process. The kitchen clock continued its steady marking of time, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its unwavering gaze. Each tick marked another moment of my life that I could choose to live on my own terms. The revelation that I didn't need their permission to live my own life settled over me like a warm coat on a cold morning. Michael and Rebecca stood in my kitchen, looking like actors who'd forgotten their lines in a play that had suddenly changed genres without warning. Their carefully rehearsed intervention had become something entirely different, a negotiation where they'd unexpectedly discovered they lacked the authority they'd assumed they possessed. Rebecca's professional composure had completely dissolved, replaced by the raw frustration of someone accustomed to closing deals who'd encountered a client who simply refused to be sold. But their embarrassment over hasty announcements wasn't my responsibility to resolve. The commitments they'd made without consulting me belonged entirely to them. Michael's approach had shifted toward what I recognized as attempted intimidation, disguised as concern. He spoke about legal competency evaluations, about the possibility of guardianship proceedings, but threats only worked against people who were afraid, and I'd moved beyond fear into something that felt remarkably like freedom. The son who thought he could coerce compliance with scary legal possibilities had forgotten that his mother had faced down more formidable opponents than family court judges. The kitchen table that had been covered with their financial projections suddenly looked like a workspace where I could plan my own future rather than capitulate to theirs. The first priority was financial protection and transparency. The bank accounts they'd been managing on my behalf needed to be returned to my direct control immediately. Home security came next, both physical and technological. The locks that had been changed to give them access needed new keys that remained entirely under my control. Healthcare autonomy required immediate attention as well. The doctor's appointments that had been scheduled around their convenience needed to be rescheduled according to my preferences. Rebecca's voice cut through my planning with questions about how I intended to manage these changes on my own. Apparently unable to conceive that someone my age could research options and make phone calls. But I'd been managing complex situations and coordinating multiple moving parts since before she was born. The skills that had navigated household budgets, family schedules, school systems hadn't suddenly evaporated. Michael's frustration was becoming increasingly visible as he realized that his authority over my situation was largely imaginary. The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of independence and responsibility. The consequences of my choices belonged to me, just as the consequences of their choices belonged to them. Their fears about my capacity to live independently seemed largely based on stereotypes about aging, rather than any specific evidence of declining capabilities. Rebecca's folder of assisted living photographs suddenly looked like advertisements for a lifestyle I had no interest in purchasing. The scheduled activities and supervised social interactions might suit people who'd never learned to create their own meaning and structure, but they felt like imprisonment to someone who'd spent decades making her own choices. The morning that had begun with their ultimatum about my future had transformed into an afternoon of planning for a very different kind of tomorrow. Michael's final attempt at control involved threats about changing his will and limiting contact with future grandchildren if I insisted on maintaining my independence. But conditional love wasn't worth the price he was asking me to pay for it. The relationships that required me to surrender my autonomy weren't relationships worth preserving. The kitchen clock had marked the passage of hours, while we'd wrestled with questions that should have had simple answers. Standing in the home I'd made with my own hands and heart over the course of decades, I felt the woman I'd been before fear and guilt had clouded my judgment returning with crystalline clarity. The late afternoon light slanted through my kitchen windows, with the golden quality that photographers call magic hour, illuminating the scene of my liberation with theatrical perfection. Michael and Rebecca had retreated to the far side of the kitchen, their unified front crumbling, as they realized their carefully orchestrated intervention had not only failed, but had awakened something they'd never expected to encounter. Rebecca was frantically gathering the scattered documents from the table, her movements sharp with the kind of anger that comes from professional embarrassment. The folders and brochures that had seemed so authoritative when she'd first spread them across my table now looked like what they'd always been: sales materials designed to convince someone to purchase a product they didn't want. Michael's face had gone through several color changes over the course of our conversation, settling finally on a pale gray that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The mother he'd grown accustomed to managing with efficient authority had been replaced by someone who looked remarkably like the woman who'd raised him to be strong and independent. The kitchen, where I'd been made to feel like a guest, tolerated in someone else's house, had reclaimed its rightful status as the heart of my domain. Something inside my chest began to tighten as I listened to them dismantle my independence with surgical precision. But then something unexpected happened. A calm certainty settled over me. Rebecca gathered her papers with movements that suggested our conversation was over, though not in the way she'd anticipated when she'd arrived that morning with folders full of arrangements. The assisted living facility would need to be notified that their expected resident had declined to take occupancy. The deposits they'd placed would need to be forfeited or transferred. But those conversations belonged to them. Consequences of their decision to proceed without adequate consultation with the person whose life they'd been planning. Michael's voice carried genuine sadness when he asked whether this meant the end of our relationship, whether my insistence on independence would require cutting ties with family members. The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. I wasn't rejecting family relationships. I was rejecting family control. Real relationships could survive disagreement about major life decisions. Love that required my compliance with others' preferences wasn't the kind of love worth preserving at any cost. Evening shadows had begun to gather in corners of the room, where afternoon light no longer reached, marking the passage of a day that had started with one vision of my future and ended with an entirely different understanding. Standing in the home I'd created over decades of careful attention and gradual improvement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death: the absolute certainty that I retained the authority to shape my own tomorrow. Michael and Rebecca moved toward the door with the careful politeness of people ending a business meeting that hadn't gone according to plan. Their departure would mark the beginning of something new, a chapter of my life written by the only person who'd ever had the right to hold the pen. The kitchen felt different after they left, as if the very air had been purified by the removal of expectations that had never belonged there in the first place. Evening light slanted through windows I'd cleaned and maintained for 4 decades, illuminating a space that belonged entirely to me again. The telephone on the counter seemed to beckon with possibilities I hadn't considered in months. Social connections that had been discouraged could be restored. My first call was to the bank, where Michael had convinced them to redirect my statements to his address for my convenience and security. Restoring my direct access to my own financial information required nothing more than my identification and a clear statement of my preferences. The young woman on the phone seemed genuinely surprised that someone my age was calling to reclaim control over their own accounts, perhaps having absorbed cultural assumptions about aging and competence. The second call was to my doctor's office, where Rebecca had been scheduling my appointments around her availability rather than mine. Each phone call restored another piece of my independence, another element of adult authority that had been gradually surrendered to people who'd convinced me their management was necessary. The locksmith I contacted could come the following morning to change the locks Michael and Rebecca had modified to ensure their access to my house. Evening had settled fully over the neighborhood by the time I finished making the practical arrangements necessary to restore my independence. The sounds of family life from nearby houses reminded me that I was part of a community that existed independently of family approval or supervision. The garden visible through my kitchen window held the promise of spring growth and summer abundance, plants continuing their cycles without concern for human drama. Standing in my kitchen with the last traces of daylight fading from the sky, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before David's death. Absolute certainty that I retained both the right and capacity to determine my own future. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity that makes everything appear exactly as it is, rather than as others wish it to be. I awakened in my own bed, in my own house, with my own schedule stretching ahead, like an open invitation to live according to my preferences. The locksmith arrived precisely when promised, a competent professional who understood that changing locks was a straightforward matter of security and privacy, rather than complex family drama. New keys lay warm in my palm, tangible symbols of restored autonomy and control over my own living space. Each small action I took throughout the morning felt significant. Choosing what to eat for breakfast, when to check the mail, which windows to open for fresh air. The telephone rang frequently as I implemented practical changes necessary to reclaim full control over my financial and medical affairs. The ease with which I could restore my independence highlighted how artificial the crisis had been that Michael and Rebecca had constructed around my living situation. A neighbor I'd known for decades stopped by to check on me after noticing unusual activity around my house the previous day. Martha had been watching from her kitchen window when Michael and Rebecca left, with expressions that suggested their visit hadn't gone according to plan. Our conversation over coffee reminded me of the community connections that existed independently of family approval or oversight. Martha had been managing her own household since her husband's death 3 years earlier, navigating the challenges of aging with practical wisdom from experience. She mentioned a friend who'd been pressured by adult children to move to assisted living, despite preferring to remain in her own home. The woman had eventually capitulated to their demands and spent her final 2 years in institutional care, regretting the decision until the day she died. Martha's story served as a sobering reminder of what might have happened if I hadn't found the strength to resist yesterday's intervention. The afternoon brought a visit from my attorney, a woman who understood the difference between competent adults making informed decisions and family members attempting to override those decisions. Her review of the documents Michael and Rebecca had prepared revealed several troubling elements that went beyond simple planning into potential legal overreach. The power of attorney forms would have granted them authority over financial decisions far beyond what most people understood such documents to contain. The guardianship petitions, if successful, would have legally stripped away my right to make any significant decisions about my own life. Her professional assessment confirmed what I'd suspected. Their preparation had been thorough and systematic, designed to create a legal framework that would have made reversal difficult or impossible. The intervention I'd experienced wasn't a spontaneous expression of concern, but rather the culmination of months of planning that had proceeded without my knowledge. Evening brought time for reflection on a day spent reclaiming pieces of my life that had been gradually surrendered over the past 2 years. Each phone call made, each arrangement changed, each decision restored to my control had contributed to a growing sense of empowerment that felt remarkably like coming back to life. The garden visible through my kitchen window showed signs of spring growth that had continued regardless of human drama and family conflicts. The house around me felt different now, not just because the locks had been changed, but because the fundamental question of who had authority over my life had been definitively answered. The days following my declaration brought changes that extended far beyond the practical matters of locks and bank accounts. Word of my refusal to cooperate with Michael and Rebecca's plans had somehow spread through family networks with the efficiency that only shocking news seemed to generate. My sister called from Arizona, with a mixture of concern and admiration in her voice. Helen had been dealing with similar pressure from her own adult children. Our conversation stretched over an hour as we compared experiences and strategies. Two women who'd discovered that defending independence required more energy than either had expected. The relief in Helen's voice, when she realized she wasn't alone in facing these challenges, highlighted how isolated family members could become when dealing with well-meaning relatives. Michael's brother called 3 days later with an awkward attempt at mediation that revealed how uncomfortable my resistance had made extended family members. David's brother had always been diplomatic, but his careful neutrality couldn't disguise his relief that he wouldn't be facing similar decisions about elderly relatives anytime soon. The conversation highlighted how family dynamics could be distorted by assumptions about aging and authority. He spoke about Michael's stress and worry, as if my refusal to accept help was somehow cruel. But his perspective revealed how outsiders viewed family conflicts when they only heard one side of the story. Michael and Rebecca had presented their intervention as generous assistance being ungratefully rejected. Rebecca's mother called with what sounded like a prepared speech about family obligations and the importance of accepting help gracefully when offered with loving intentions. The conversation revealed how Rebecca had been processing the failure of their intervention as evidence of my selfishness rather than recognition of their overreach. The grocery store clerk who'd known me for years commented on how much better I looked than in recent months, noting energy and confidence that had been absent during supervised shopping trips. Martha, from next door, had become an unofficial advisor and ally, sharing practical strategies she'd developed for maintaining independence while aging in place. Our daily coffee conversations had evolved into an informal support group for women determined to age on their own terms rather than submit to family management. The assisted living facility called twice during the week, initially to confirm my arrival date, and then to understand why arrangements Michael and Rebecca had made were being canceled. The administrative confusion that resulted from their assumptions about my compliance provided a small but satisfying reminder that institutional systems couldn't simply absorb people without their consent. Spring weather had settled over the neighborhood with gentle persistence. My garden called for attention that had been deferred during months of family drama. Returning to soil preparation and planting felt like reclaiming another piece of myself that had been temporarily set aside. The physical work of gardening provided a perfect counter-argument to assumptions about my declining capabilities. The strength required for digging, the coordination needed for careful planting, demonstrated continuing competence. Neighbors who stopped to admire emerging flowers treated me as a competent adult whose choices deserved respect rather than as a problem requiring management. 3 weeks had passed since the morning that changed everything, and my daily routines had settled into patterns that felt both familiar and remarkably different. The basic activities remained the same: morning coffee, household tasks, gardening, but each was now undertaken with the confidence of someone who'd reclaimed authority to make her own choices. The medical alert system I'd installed provided emergency response capability without requiring institutional supervision or family oversight. Home maintenance contract I'd arranged addressed their concerns about repairs while allowing me to remain in control of scheduling and priorities. Grocery delivery service had eliminated their worries about my driving, while actually improving my nutrition through access to better quality food than I'd been purchasing during supervised shopping. The transportation service for seniors provided safe, reliable access to medical appointments and social activities without requiring me to surrender my car keys. Social connections that had been discouraged during family management had been restored and expanded beyond their previous scope. The book club I'd belonged to for years welcomed me back with warmth that suggested my absence had been noticed and regretted. The senior center that had been dismissed by Michael and Rebecca offered sophisticated programming and social connections with people whose life experiences were far more varied than institutional activities could accommodate. Financial management had returned to my direct control, with results that challenged every assumption Michael and Rebecca had made about my declining capabilities. The investment advisor I'd selected understood the importance of maintaining autonomy while managing risk, creating a financial plan that supported my independence. Legal documents had been revised to reflect my current priorities and relationships rather than assumptions about family loyalty and natural inheritance patterns. The power of attorney that Michael had been so eager to obtain had been granted to my attorney, a professional who understood the difference between acting in my best interests and acting according to her own preferences. Morning walks through the neighborhood had become a source of unexpected social connection, as I encountered other residents committed to aging in place on their own terms. The conversations with neighbors revealed how many people were facing similar pressures from adult children who'd convinced themselves that love required control. Garden work had progressed through spring preparation into early summer maintenance, providing both physical exercise and emotional satisfaction that no structured activity program could match. The vegetables I'd planted were beginning to produce food that would supplement my diet, with fresh ingredients chosen and grown according to my own preferences. The flowers that bloomed in carefully planned succession provided beauty and accomplishment that felt particularly meaningful because they resulted from my own planning and effort. Afternoon reading had returned to books selected according to my interests, rather than those deemed appropriate for my age group or cognitive capacity. Evening phone conversations with Helen and other friends had evolved into an informal support network for women committed to aging with dignity and independence. Sleep came easily now, without the anxiety that had characterized bedtimes during months when my future had been under negotiation by people who'd excluded me from the discussion. 6 months had passed since the morning when Michael's shouted words had shattered the last illusions about our family relationship, and autumn was painting the neighborhood in colors that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to remain. The garden that had been a source of controversy during family discussions had produced a harvest that exceeded even my own expectations. Martha and I had developed a routine of sharing garden produce and preserving techniques that turned autumn preparation into a social activity rather than solitary chore. Her friendship had evolved into something that felt like chosen family, relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation and blood ties. My health had actually improved during the months of restored independence, confirming research about the relationship between autonomy and well-being. The stress-related symptoms that had developed during the period of family control had resolved as I'd reclaimed authority over my daily choices and future planning. The financial projections that Michael and Rebecca had prepared with such certainty had proven unnecessarily pessimistic, partly because they'd been based on assumptions about my needs rather than careful analysis. Medical appointments had returned to discussions between doctor and patient rather than family conferences where my presence felt optional and my preferences seemed irrelevant. Legal protections were now in place to prevent future attempts at inappropriate intervention, with clear directives about my preferences for care and decision-making authority assigned to people who demonstrated respect for my autonomy. The house that had been viewed as a burden requiring expensive maintenance had proven manageable through service contracts and careful planning that preserved my ownership and control. Transportation arrangements had evolved into a flexible system that maintained my mobility without relying on driving abilities that might eventually change. Technology that had been dismissed as too complex for someone my age had proven surprisingly manageable when approached without assumptions about my limitations. The social isolation that Michael and Rebecca had feared would result from independent living had been replaced by community connections that felt more authentic and supportive than family relationships that had required constant gratitude. Evening reflection had become a source of satisfaction rather than anxiety. with each day bringing evidence of continuing competence and growth rather than decline and diminishment. Winter preparation was underway, with the kind of practical planning that had characterized my approach to seasonal challenges throughout decades of homeownership. The assisted living facility that had been selected for my residence had closed due to financial difficulties, providing a sobering reminder that institutional care offered no guarantees of stability. Family relationships had settled into a pattern of limited contact that preserved dignity on both sides while acknowledging fundamental differences about appropriate boundaries between generations. Holiday cards were exchanged. Occasional phone calls maintained cordial connection, but the power struggle over control of my life had ended definitively in favor of the person whose life it actually was. 5 years had passed since the morning that changed everything, and I was celebrating my 80th birthday, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be part of my life. The party was happening in my garden, among flowers and vegetables that had thrived under care that combined experience with the satisfaction of working toward goals I'd selected for myself. Martha had coordinated the celebration with efficiency that understood meaningful gatherings required attention to participants' preferences rather than conventional expectations about appropriate activities for elderly people. The guest list included friends from the book club, colleagues from volunteer work, neighbors who'd become chosen family, and younger people who valued intergenerational connections based on mutual respect. The cake had been made in my own kitchen, using a recipe I'd perfected through decades of birthday celebrations, though now the cooking was shared pleasure with friends. The candles that needed blowing out represented years of continued growth and adaptation, rather than accumulated decline toward inevitable dependency. Michael and Rebecca had sent a card with generic birthday wishes that acknowledged the occasion without referencing our family history or expressing any understanding of how their intervention had catalyzed my transformation. The relationship with my son had settled into distant politeness that preserved dignity on both sides while acknowledging fundamental differences about appropriate boundaries between generations. Helen had visited from Arizona the previous month, marveling at the garden, the community connections, and the evidence of continuing vitality that challenged every assumption about what aging must involve. The house, that had been viewed as too much responsibility for someone my age, had been adapted through modifications that supported aging in place while preserving character and comfort. Garden beds had been raised to heights that eliminated bending and kneeling, while actually increasing productivity through improved soil drainage and easier access. The financial management that Michael and Rebecca had deemed beyond my capabilities had proven remarkably successful, with careful budgeting, providing security that exceeded what their institutional solution could have delivered. Healthcare had become a collaborative process between me and providers who respected my right to make informed decisions about treatment options and quality of life priorities. The community leadership role I'd developed through volunteer work had evolved into advocacy for elder rights and community resources that supported aging in place. Educational pursuits that had been dismissed as inappropriate for someone my age had included audit courses at the community college and online classes about topics that interested me. Travel that had been deemed too risky for independent elderly people had included carefully planned trips that expanded horizons while demonstrating continuing capacity for complex logistics. Writing projects had begun as personal reflection, but evolved into articles and essays about aging with dignity that had been published in newsletters and magazines. Mentoring relationships with younger women had developed naturally through volunteer work, providing opportunities to share wisdom while learning about perspectives facing different generations. Legal documents had been updated regularly to reflect evolving relationships and changing priorities, ensuring my wishes would be respected, even if I became unable to advocate for myself. Estate planning had been restructured to benefit people and organizations that had demonstrated commitment to supporting autonomy and dignity for elderly people. The story of my resistance to family control had become part of a larger movement of elderly people who'd refused to cooperate with their own diminishment. Research had validated what my experience had demonstrated: that autonomy and choice were crucial for healthy aging, that institutional care often accelerated decline it claimed to prevent. The woman who'd stood uncertainly in her kitchen while others planned her future had become an example of what remained possible when people refused to accept that age automatically meant incompetence. The birthday celebration that evening included toasts to independence, friendship, and the courage to resist diminishment in any form. The garden that surrounded us held evidence of continuing growth and adaptation, natural cycles that would continue as long as I remained able to participate, according to my own assessment of my changing needs. The future that stretched ahead still held possibilities for contribution and growth, rather than managed decline toward institutional care that would have eliminated choice and reduced life to basic survival. As candles flickered in the gentle evening breeze, and friends shared stories that celebrated resilience and choice, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived on one's own terms. The woman I'd become at 80 bore little resemblance to the person who'd been allowing her independence to be gradually eroded. But the transformation had been built on foundations that had always existed. The last guests departed as darkness settled over the neighborhood, leaving me in the garden where so much growth had occurred. Plants thriving under careful tending, but also personal renewal. Tomorrow would bring another day of choices made according to my preferences, and activities selected because they brought meaning and joy. Another opportunity to continue writing my own story. Standing among the flowers that had been planted and tended by my own hands, I felt the profound peace that comes from knowing that independence, once reclaimed, becomes a foundation for everything else that makes life worth living. The journey from diminishment to empowerment had taught me that it's never too late to remember who you are and claim the authority to remain that person for whatever time remains.